Before the freezer aisle existed, my grandmother spent every Sunday morning at that same counter, the flour dust already settled into the grain of the wood before any of us were even awake. She never wrote a menu down. She looked at what was left in the pantry after a long week and built dessert around whatever needed using up first. Between the mid-1940s and the late 1950s, she went through more of these than anyone in the family could count, and I don't remember her ever repeating the same 1-2 weeks running. These are 12 of them, roughly in the order the year would have brought them around. Spring meant the church calendar filling back up after a quiet winter, and chess pie was always the first thing she reached for once potluck started again. It was the pie every table needed at least 2 of, because one never made it past the first hour. My grandmother always cracked the top on purpose. She said a smooth top meant you'd overbeaten the eggs, and she took some quiet pride in a pie that looked a little rough around the edges. Pantry staples had to stretch further than eggs and cream back then, so cooks leaned on sugar, butter, and a spoonful of cornmeal or vinegar to hold everything together, keeping the whole pie under $1. Whisk eggs, sugar, melted butter, vinegar, and cornmeal. Pour into an unbaked shell and bake at 350 degrees. Pull it the moment the center still jiggles like set gelatin, since it firms up as it cools, and waiting too long turns the filling rubbery. I never grew to love this one myself, if I'm honest, but every plate at that table came back empty regardless. By the time rationing hit in earnest, dessert stopped being about what tasted best and started being about what could be made with almost nothing, and wacky cake was the answer she leaned on most. It skipped eggs, milk, and butter entirely, mixed right in the baking pan to save on dishes when soap was rationed too. She made this during those years, poking 3 wells into the flour for oil, vinegar, and vanilla, a method she never explained until I asked why the cake had holes punched into it before it even went in the oven. Vinegar meeting baking soda did the lifting instead. Kitchen chemistry she trusted completely, and the whole pan came together for maybe 40 cents. Mix the dry ingredients in the pan, make 3 wells, add the wet ingredients, stir until just combined, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. Do not overmix once the vinegar hits the soda, since that fizz is your only rise. It tasted better than it had any right to, and became the kind of cake nobody outside the family ever guessed had no eggs in it at all. Fall brought the tomato soup cake out, and it became something of a running joke at every gathering because my grandmother would not reveal the secret ingredient until guests had already asked for seconds. It eats like a spice cake with no hint of tomato anywhere in the flavor. Canned soup was a pantry staple by the 1930s, and it added moisture and tang in place of buttermilk, all for about 10 cents a can. Mix the soup with baking soda so it foams, fold into a spiced batter with raisins, and bake at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. Let the soda react with the soup first, or the cake bakes up dense instead of light. Guests always guessed cinnamon and cloves were doing the heavy lifting, and nobody ever guessed right. When lemons weren't shipping in from the south, which was most winters, vinegar pie filled the gap, and it's the one recipe she credited entirely to her own mother rather than claiming as her own invention. She learned it during the Depression, when citrus was a luxury nobody in that house could count on seeing before spring. It's built like a chess pie, but leans on cider vinegar for its tang instead of lemon juice, all for under 70 cents. Whisk everything together. Pour into a shell and bake at 350 degrees until the center wobbles slightly. Taste your vinegar before pouring it in, since strength varies enough that one bottle tastes sharp while another tastes almost flat. It fooled plenty of guests into thinking it was lemon, and she let them believe it more often than not. Christmas meant ambrosia salad appeared on the table whether anyone asked for it or not, sitting oddly on the savory side of the spread despite being pure dessert underneath the label. My grandmother made this every year, and her neighbors' boys fought over the last maraschino cherry every single time. Citrus and coconut became affordable and easy to ship by the 1930s and 40s, making this a holiday showpiece for about $1 a bowl. Segment the citrus, drain the pineapple well, fold in the coconut and a bit of whipped cream, and chill it for 2 hours. Draining the fruit well is the step people skip, and a watery ambrosia turns the whole bowl soupy. I never quite understood calling it a salad myself, but nobody argued once the bowl came back empty. October always meant applesauce cake, timed to whatever the neighbor's apple tree dropped that year, usually more than any single family could eat fresh before it spoiled. She made this the same week almost every year, whether the harvest was generous or thin. Applesauce replaced the eggs and part of the fat in the batter, a smart stretch when butter and eggs cost dearly. Mix wet and dry ingredients separately, then combine them gently, and bake at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. Do not overmix, since applesauce cakes turn tough fast if you beat the air out chasing a smooth batter. This recipe was never meant to have. It never got requested by name, but the pan was always the first one empty by the end of the evening. She swore boiled raisin cake was the moistest cake she ever made, and having tasted most of what came out of that kitchen over the years, I'm inclined to agree. The name comes from boiling the raisins first, which plumps them and releases their sugar straight into the batter. Boiling the fruit stretched sugar further at a time when sugar itself was often rationed, and the whole cake came together for roughly 70 cents. Boil raisins in water for 10 minutes. Cool the liquid. Use it in place of plain water in the batter and bake at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. Use the raisin water while it's still warm, since adding it cold makes the batter seize up. Summer brought the graham cracker icebox cake out of hiding, a dessert that needed no oven at all, in a house already too hot to stand in most July afternoons. My grandmother assembled this the night before every 4th of July without fail. Refrigerators made no baked desserts possible for the first time in her lifetime, and crackers softened into a cake-like texture overnight, all for about $1 a pan. Layer crackers and pudding, finishing with pudding on top, and refrigerated overnight. The full rest matters, since cutting it short leaves the crackers crisp instead of soft. The kids never noticed there was no oven involved, and that was always exactly the point. Molasses crumb cake used molasses instead of white sugar, mostly because it was cheaper and kept far longer in a pantry that didn't always get restocked on schedule. My grandmother topped hers with a buttery crumb she pressed on with her whole palm, never a spoon. A crumb topping stretched a small amount of butter across a whole cake, all for about 60 cents. Mix a molasses batter, top it generously with a butter and flour crumb, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. Press the crumb down firmly, since a loose crumb just scatters off instead of forming that crackled crust she always aimed for. She'd eat the crumb topping first, every time, and call the rest of the cake optional. Jell-O poke cake came along later, once boxed gelatin became a fixture on pantry shelves everywhere, and it was the one dessert on this list that genuinely excited us kids the way none of the older recipes ever quite managed to. Grandma made this the summer flavors expanded past the usual red and green, and she tried every new color on us in turn to see which one we'd claim as a favorite. A plain cake gets poked full of holes, then soaked with gelatin so the color runs through every slice, all for about $1.50. Bake and cool the cake. Poke holes with a fork, pour dissolved gelatin over it while still warm, and chill for 4 hours. Poke the holes while the cake is still warm, since a cooled cake resists the gelatin and leaves the color sitting only on the surface. Every birthday in that house meant oatmeal cake with broiled icing instead of anything fancier from a bakery, and it used cooked oatmeal folded into the batter to keep the cake moist for days after baking. My grandmother made this one so consistently, I can't picture a birthday without it sitting somewhere on the counter. Oats were cheap and filling, and broiling the icing instead of baking it separately saved both sugar and time, all for about $1 total. Soak oats in boiling water, fold them into the batter, bake at 350 degrees, then top with butter and coconut and broil for 2 minutes. Watch the broiler the entire time, since that topping turns from golden to burnt in under 30 seconds. It never looked like much, but it disappeared before the candles had even finished cooling, and rice pudding closed out most of those Sunday dinners, using up whatever was left of the milk and rice before Monday's shopping. My grandmother served hers warm, never chilled, with just a dusting of nutmeg on top, and never apologized for how plain it looked next to everything else. Rice and milk were cheap staples in any kitchen, and a slow stovetop pudding turned leftovers into dessert without spending a single extra cent. Simmer rice and milk until tender, whisk in beaten eggs and sugar off the heat, and stir until it thickens into something you can hold a spoon upright in. Temper the eggs slowly with hot milk first, or you'll end up with scrambled bits instead of a smooth custard. It was never fancy, and she never pretended it was, just the last thing standing between the fridge and Monday's shopping list. 12 desserts, and not one of them written down anywhere I ever found. She kept the whole list in her head, adjusted week to week by whatever the pantry handed her, and never once seemed to think it was worth writing down for anyone else to follow. I've spent years trying to get these exactly right, and I still think she'd find something to correct in every single one of them.